Hey guys, so I come to you for part 11 of my bookshelf tour, the final installment in the nonfiction. So this will be the end of the bulk of my book collection, and after this, as I feel like I've said a million times, you're probably gonna sick of it. All we have after this is reference, painting books, and then non-bookish things, my CDs and my DVDs, which I will go through. So anyway, I will jump right into this installment. First book here is The Viking Portable Nietzsche, which is edited and translated by Walter Kaufmann. This contains The Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Nietzsche contra Wagner, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and also has a bunch of his letters and sort of journal and notebook entries, which is kind of cool. The second one is another Nietzsche. This is on the genealogy of morals and Ecce Homo. The genealogy of morals I have read. Ecce Homo I have not read, but I really want to get to it. Next up is Dakota, A Spiritual Geography by Kathleen Norris, which I was attracted to because I love the American West, and it's all about, this is a sort of memoir-ish book about the Great Plains. And we have two nonfiction books by Mary Oliver. So this is a poetry handbook, which I think is a really nice intro to writing poetry, to the basic concepts of poetry. And then Upstream, which is a collection of her essays, which is okay on the whole. They're not spectacular, but she does write very eloquently about, in particular, Edgar Allan Poe and Ralph Waldo Emerson. This next one is Prison Writings, My Life is My Sundance by Leonard Peltier. Then we have The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. The Sounds of Poetry by Robert Pinsky. Then we have a little bit of Plato here. This is The Dialogues of Plato. This contains the Apology, the Crito, the Euthyphro, the Phaedo, Protagoras, Meno, Symposium, and Gorgias. And we have my big volume of The Republic. So this is translated by Alan Bloom, and it also contains a big essay, an introduction, and a big essay in the back by Alan Bloom, which is really not just like an afterword or something. It really is like a big interpretive essay in its own right. And I actually haven't read it yet, but when I reread The Republic, it will be in this volume, and I will read that. Then we have just a Penguin classic of The Symposium. Next up is Opera 101, A Complete Guide to Learning and Loving Opera by Fred Plotkin. A really nice introductory guide to opera that I actually wouldn't recommend as your first book on opera. There's one that we're going to come to in this same part of the bookshelf tour that I do recommend. But the Opera 101 is really good, but it's not as accessible as the one I'm going to come to. So stay tuned for that one. This is The Rise of the Roman Empire by Polybius. The Evolution of Beauty, How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us by Richard O. Prum, which I found very, very interesting. A Passion for Books, edited by Harold Rabinowitz and Rob Kaplan. I'm not going to bother reading to you the subtitle because it's like a paragraph long, but it's just a collection of essays about the love of books and about collecting books and about reading and such. I've read a few of the essays in it, and they are really fun. This is Phantoms in the Brain, Probing the Mysteries of the Human Mind by V.S. Ramachandran and Sandra Blakesley, which is excellent. It was one of my books of the year in, I think, 2017. It's all about different cases that V.S. Ramachandran has worked on where patients have had brain damage, and he sort of uses those cases of brain damage to investigate how the typical human brain works. And some of the cases he talks about are just absolutely fascinating. It just blew my mind, honestly, and kind of solidified my belief that there is no such thing as a self, which, you could go to the Buddha to learn, but you could also go to neuroscience to learn. This next one is The New Trail of Tears, How Washington is Destroying American Indians by Naomi Schaefer Riley, a very, very important and harrowing book, I have to say. I think if you're an American, it's kind of a must-read. But yeah, it is really good and really short, so there's not really any excuse not to read it. Is Classical Dance, The Ballet Goer's Guide to Technique and Performance by Jane Robbins. This is Absence of Mind, The Dispelling of Inwardness from the Modern Myth of the Self. The Dispelling of Inwardness from the Modern Myth of the Self. And this is Marilyn Robinson's Terry Lectures that she delivered at Yale. And it's really, really interesting. And, I don't agree with everything in it, as tends to be the case with Marilyn Robinson's nonfiction. But it's really, really interesting. It's really well written. It's really eloquent. So I do recommend it. And, we're going to stick with Marilyn Robinson for a few books. This is The Death of Adam, Essays on Modern Thought by Marilyn Robinson, which is, again, I don't agree with everything, but I think it's absolutely fascinating and worth reading, in particular, and important in certain cases, because she, in particular, has this essay about Darwinism and the sort of legacy of Darwinism in the modern world, and the belief in the modern world, particularly in the United States, that the only value anything has is basically in its dollar value, and that should be the only thing driving our behavior and our, government policies and such. I really recommend that one. And then we have some Marilyn Robinson that I haven't read. This is The Givenness of Things, a collection of essays. And then the last Marilyn Robinson I have is When I Was a Child, I Read Books, which I also haven't read yet, but I think should be nice, because, it sounds like it's kind of about reading and such. And then we have two books by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, which I do find fascinating, and this is On the Social Contract. And again, Rousseau, like Robinson, I don't agree with him on everything, but I find him really, really interesting, and he has provoked, and I do agree with him on some points, and I think he's a really important thinker, he really influenced, like, Karl Marx, and also Sigmund Freud, actually, in particular in The Civilization and Its Discontents. He really had a big influence on Freud. And we have The History of Alexander by Quintus Curtius Rufus, which I really, really enjoyed. I really like this. Just a ancient kind of a source about Alexander the Great, and it's a lot of fun. It's not exactly, like, historically accurate, unfortunately, but I love anything about Alexander the Great, basically. And then next up we have some Bertrand Russell. This is What I Believe, which is sort of about religion and sort of skepticism of religion. And then here we have Why I'm Not a Christian and Other Essays, which obviously is a collection of essays on religion. We return to neuroscience for the next one. This is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales by Oliver Sacks, which I haven't read, but which is kind of a classic in the sort of small body of literature on neuroscience, popular books on neuroscience. And as I understand it, it is sort of like Phantoms in the Brain, a series of sort of case studies about patients with brain damage who Oliver Sacks worked with, and should be really interesting. I do hope I get to it this year, but we will see. And then we go back to the classics. This is The Jugurthine War and the Conspiracy of Catiline by Sallust. This is The Grand Tetons by Margaret Sanborn. The Short Oxford History of English Literature by Andrew Sanders. Then we go back to sort of psychology, sort of neuroscience. This is Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst by Robert Sapolsky, which really is kind of an introductory volume on social psychology. Really, there is a lot of neuroscience in it too, but it really is mostly about social psychology. And as that, it is really good. Really kind of omnivorous too, though. It touches on like behavioral economics and sort of morality, philosophy, and such. It's really, really good. And speaking of philosophy, we have Kant, A Very Short Introduction by Roger Scruton. Next up, some history. We have The Story of the Jews, Finding the Words, 1000 BC to 1492 AD by Simon Schama. The Lives of the Great Composers by Harold Schoenberg. Essays and Aphorisms by Arthur Schopenhauer. I would say that if I were naming thinkers who have had the most influence on the way that I think, Arthur Schopenhauer would be pretty far up there. Just his very pessimistic view of the human condition and human life really resonated with me when I read it, and I still kind of subscribe to it. Perhaps I have a bit more of an affirmative view of human life, but I still think Schopenhauer makes some points that are difficult to argue with regards to just how, like, bleak human existence is. This next one is that opera book I mentioned that I would recommend above Opera 101. This is A Mad Love, An Introduction to Opera by Vivian Schweitzer, which is a very spirited walk through the history of opera, really. She starts, back in the early 1600s with the very first opera, by Claudia Monteverdi, and just moves forward through, Mozart, Wagner, into the 20th century with Richard Strauss and Philip Glass. And she, describes the basic mechanisms of opera. What is an aria, what is an opera buffa, what is an opera seria, other things. She takes you a little bit through the history of music and how opera has played into that as well. Through that, she just teaches you how to appreciate opera, really. And I think what she does really well is she does a great job of getting the reader excited about the operas, about going to see the operas that she discusses. Just the way she'll describe the plot and the music and the characters. Every time that I read one, I got really excited about going to listen to the opera and to watch it. So, I would recommend that as an introductory volume to opera. We go back once again to the ancient world. This is Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. This is the complete letters. I found these to be very insightful, to have a lot of great sort of quotes, sort of one-liners in them. But on the whole, it could get very, very tedious, I have to say. It got very repetitive, I think, and just a little droning, to be honest. Like, just him sort of going on like your grandpa when he's moralizing on some subject that you aren't particularly interested in. And Seneca felt a little bit like that, unfortunately, at times. But there were, again, a lot of isolated moments where I found a lot of great insight and good quotes in that book. Next is another collection of letters. This is Anne Sexton, A Self-Portrait in Letters, edited by Linda Gray Sexton and Lois Ames. I love Anne Sexton's poetry, and I want to learn more about her life, and I have this, and I have the biography by Diane Middlebrook, and I just need to do that. Perhaps I need to revisit her poetry, and then, come to these books. The Perfect Wagnerite, a commentary on the on the Nibelung's Ring by George Bernard Shaw, which is just his sort of interpretation of the ring cycle, which I have yet to read, but I'm really excited to read. This is The Noonday Demon, an Atlas of Depression by Andrew Solomon. This is The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I have yet to read, and which I believe is only volume 1, but all 3 volumes of this work are, a huge thing, so I just have volume 1 for now. Now we have a bunch of Susan Sontag, most of which I have yet to read, starting with the first one. Oh, well, no, this is one that I have read. So this is Illness as Metaphor and AIDS and Its Metaphors, one of my top nonfiction books of last year. It is brilliant, it is eloquent, I just absolutely love its perspective, the perspective she gives on illness, and, I don't love it, but I think it's very interesting and something I hadn't thought of, which is just what Susan Sontag is brilliant at, is just that, pointing you to things that you wouldn't have even thought of were important, as important. And I would definitely recommend that one. This next one is On Photography, which I have not read yet. Next one is Reborn, which are a collection of her journals and notebooks, which I also have yet to read. I'm not sure whether the Reborn I will read like straight through from beginning to end, or whether I'll sort of just leave it at my bedside and maybe poke around in it and sort of read little snippets, because I feel like with a journal or a notebook, like, you're not always meant to read it like cover to cover, because there's not always like the narrative drive of a typical book in a journal or a notebook. So I don't know, if you've read Reborn, or if you read other notebooks and journals, how do you recommend you read it? Do you recommend that you start at the beginning and go to the end, or do you recommend that you sort of just poke around and read what you feel? Let me know if you have experience with that. But the next one is Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag, which she sort of considered to be a kind of addendum to On Photography. So I have read that, and I really like it. I, again, like with Illness as a Metaphor, just points out a lot of things that you don't see, that you don't notice, that you don't think are important, and points them out how important they are. And then finally we have a Susan Sontag reader, which I have yet to really poke into yet. But yeah, again, Susan Sontag, someone I need to get to. This is The Making of the Middle Ages by R.W. Southern. The Annals of Imperial Rome by Tacitus, which I remember really, really liking. Steve just talked about Tacitus in his March of the Penguins, and it just got me interested all over again in rereading that, because I read it the first time and liked parts of it, found other parts of it a little bit tedious, but, like, again, want to give it another try. This is the collected essays and poems of Henry David Thoreau. After I finished reading the essays of Emerson, which are somewhere on this shelf, which I've already talked about, I think, I want to get to reading the essays of Thoreau, and also want to get to reading this next one, which is Walden. Next up is The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Undoubtedly an important book, but not a book that I really enjoyed reading, I have to say. This is On Elizabeth Bishop by Colm Toibin. The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. The New York Times Essential Library on Opera, A Critic's Guide to the 100 Most Important Works and the Best Recordings. This is a really nice collection. It's really short. The essays in it on each opera are very brief. They're like 3 pages, literally. They're like a brief summary, brief sort of discussion of the themes, and then just a recommendation of some recordings. I find it fun to look through this at operas I have seen or operas I want to see. This is The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by David Troyer, which I'm pleased to see made the BookTube Prize long list, and I really hope it progresses forward. I would be pleased to see it go far. I don't know if it'll win. Somehow I doubt it'll win, but I would love it if it progressed, because I think it's such an important book. I read it last year. My buddy read it with Patrice Jones, and I thought it was... we both really liked it, but we thought it was so good. It's such an important story, I think. This is The Book of Forms by Louis Turco. The subtitle is A Handbook of Poetics. Really, it's just a sort of reference guide to different forms of poetry, really. Due Considerations, Essays and Criticism by John Updike. And Hugging the Shore, Essays and Criticism by John Updike, which is a huge thing. This is like almost 900 pages long. The Psalms, Structure, Content, and Message by Klaus Westermann. The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society by Norbert Wiener, which made my top 10 nonfiction books list, and which I think deservedly is there, because it is just really fascinating and really eloquent, really, learned, and I highly recommend. Letters to a Young Scientist by Edward O. Wilson. The Cloud of Unknowing and Other Works by an anonymous author. This is sort of a medieval work of mysticism, Catholic Christian mysticism, which I grabbed at a bookstore, at a used bookstore on a whim, just because I thought I'd never heard of it and thought it sounded interesting. How Fiction Works by James Wood. 3 Guineas by Virginia Woolf. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, which I do love, I adore. I've read it twice. It had a big effect on me when I read it in college, and it had just really influenced the way I think about sort of feminism and women's issues and such. I read it at a perfect time in my life, really, because I read it at the beginning of my senior year of college, and in my senior year of college, I also took a class on the philosophy of feminism, and so I read this book, and then took this semester-long class about feminism, and it was just a perfect convalescence to sort of get me more aware of social issues and such. And I also took a class on that was called the social psychology of social justice, I think, or it was either that or it was the social psychology of social issues. I'm not sure which one, but which was just all about sort of racism and oppression and the psychology of racism and oppression and sexism and other things that are, still obviously very relevant. And so there was just this perfect convalescence in my senior year of college to get me much more sort of aware of social issues and women's issues and racial issues in the United States. It was really, my senior year of college was important for me, I think, in terms of my thinking about the world. Anyway, moving on from that, this is God, the Evolution of God by Robert Wright. And then lastly, last book in my nonfiction is American Indian Stories by Zeke Kalasah. And this technically does include some of her short stories and poems, but I was mostly interested in it for the essays, which are kind of memoiristic essays about her time growing up on a Native American reservation and her time at a boarding school and such. So that's why it's in the nonfiction. But anyway, that is the end of the nonfiction, the biggest section of my bookshelf tour. So, we really are in the home stretch now, so I will be done with this soon. But anyway, as always, give me your thoughts if you've read any of these books or just find any of them interesting, and I'll be happy to chat with you. And anyway, I'll talk to you all later, and I hope you have a good weekend. Bye, guys.